Off our official recording of this web conference and get started. Thank you all so much for being here. This is session 2 of Strengths-Based Prevention That Works. Our objectives today are to learn about mindfulness, an approach with extensive research supporting it that's relatively easy and accessible to implement and is known to prevent violence. We'll also learn about bystander approaches, an approach with extensive research support that is relatively easy and accessible to implement and is known to prevent violence. We are really excited to have our guest speakers here today, Victoria and Sherry, who authored Strengths-Based Prevention That Works. I will gladly step back and let you two take it over from here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting us. We're delighted to be back here again today. And just to try to immediately dive in and have a little bit of an experiential component to this so that you can feel what it is like to experience some of these practices that we're recommending. We want to start with a short mindfulness moment. We did this last time too, for those of you who were at the first webinar. Today, I'm going to start with a different type of mindfulness meditation. Last time I did loving kindness. Today, I'm going to do a short body scan. We're just going to take about 5 minutes to do this today, but this can be something that you can easily expand into a 10 or 20-minute mindfulness session if you like. So just to get started, I'm going to, this is really a little different from a usual one because I'm also going to narrate a little bit some of the choices that we typically make when we do mindfulness in settings with people who have high levels of trauma exposure. So we do always start by inviting people to close their eyes, but as I'm sure some of you are well aware, some people with PTSD or anxiety or other issues may not want to close their eyes. So we always start our mindfulness sessions with just an invitation to either close your eyes or just gaze downward with a soft, gentle gaze. Either one is fine to choose. And then we try to be as inclusive as possible. Some people do work at standing desk, or some people may be uncomfortable with different positions. And so try to express yourself in a way that would just apply to people in a lot of situations. But we do invite people to the beginning of a body scan. Just take a moment and check your posture. Straighten up a little bit. If you are seated, maybe take a moment to make sure that your weight is balanced as equally as possible on both sides. When you invite people to sort of raise up with their posture, a correct posture is not a stick straight back. Our backs are not sticks. We all have a little bit of a natural arch in our lower back. So you don't want to try to force that out. You just want to leave that, but just try to start with a little breath and just lift up and feel that energy. Maybe give your shoulders a little roll back to help align them. If you just lift your chin ever so slightly, that will help align the spine in your neck along the spine of your back. People will almost automatically start to take deeper and slower breaths as you start talking and they start making these physical adjustments. Just encourage them to feel the energy lift up through their body and up through their head. And body scan can be good for people who have experienced trauma, if again, having always to gauge whether they're ready for this, but it's something that can be incorporated into a lot of grounding exercises. It's a common part of cognitive behavioral or dialectical behavioral therapies for trauma, and can be a good way for people to, so many of us, researchers like Vicky and myself can be some of the worst at this. My default position is to kind of experience myself as just existing from the neck up, and that my body is just a contraption for moving my head around. And mindfulness practice invites us to try to get back in touch with the rest of our body and to realize that we're just as much our feet or our knees or our hands as we are our head or our brain or our mouth. So we'll just start. If you're sitting, try to put your feet flat on the floor if you can. Just feel that connection with the earth. We're always connected through the earth, whether it's through the floor of a building or a car or wherever we might be. If you're standing, you can also just feel that connection. Just start by stretching your toes a little and just noticing what feelings that arises. There aren't any right or wrong ways to feel that. You can just feel it. You can just maybe kind of squinch your toes up a little and then relax. A lot of body scans make use of what is sometimes also called active relaxation, where you invite people to notice the contrast between tensing and relaxing of muscle sets to help draw their attention and awareness. If you're seated, or if you're standing, you can brace yourself. You can lift one foot if you're standing and twist your legs. If you're in a chair, you can try sticking your legs out. Just do a couple of ankle rolls, a couple clockwise, a couple counterclockwise. It's important in most body movement practices, so not only mindfulness, but yoga or relaxation or anything like that too, to try to keep a symmetry in the movement. So if you have people move clockwise, then also have them move counterclockwise, or if you do something with your right side, be sure to also do it with your left side. Then you can just release, and maybe you can start to feel the tension drain from your feet and out through the floor. Then just move up to your legs. Try to tighten those muscles. Or again, if you're seated, you could try stretching your legs out again and just pushing through the heel, and then it will feel that hamstring on the back of your legs tighten. Then you can point your toes and then release. As you move up the back, you do want to be gentle with the back area. So don't just invite people to tighten the back. You don't want to give them a crick or anything like that. So you can just invite them to hunch their shoulders up and relax. Or if we were doing a little bit of a longer one, I would probably invite people to twist a little bit to the right and to the left. That can be a really good position to hold for a moment, which we won't do this afternoon or some afternoon where I am. Then you can have people stretch their arms up, clench their fist, give their arms a shake. Again, just notice the difference between the two feelings. And as you shake your arms, just let the stress run out your fingers and into the ground. Your neck is also another place that's important to be gentle with, but for most people, it's okay to just let them lower their head towards their chest and let their chin move towards their chest. That can be a really nice stretch. That's a stretch I always love. Will help reduce my stress. And if you want to do a neck roll, I recommend that you just do one 180 degrees. So just turn over the right shoulder and then gently go down and around until you're looking up over the left shoulder. And then we want to go back in the other direction now to keep it symmetrical and come back to center. A full neck roll, a 360-degree one, can strain the neck, so I don't recommend doing that. Then you can have people scrunch their face up, make a face, maybe move their jaw, stretch their jaw, and then just release. Feel the relaxation in their facial muscles. And then just close with a couple of more deep breaths and asking them to notice if there's any places where they can tell that they're more relaxed or perhaps more in touch with their sensations. There's no judgment, so it doesn't matter what the answer is to that. It's just an invitation to think about it and to draw attention to this moment. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and I will turn it over to Vicki.
Great. Thanks, Sherry. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Just to talk about what we'll go over today, we're going to do a brief reminder about the prevention and the resilience portfolio model that our work is based on. So if you didn't get a chance to watch the previous webinar, we'll give you a little bit of a reminder. We'll then talk about the relational level of change related to two areas of the portfolio, which is bystander intervention. We'll then use the same strategy that we used in the previous webinar, which is we'll have our interview interlude where we'll do some question and answer. Then we'll talk about individual change, particularly for regulatory and meaning-making strengths through mindfulness. Have another interview, and then open it up for question and answer from you all. So, this was a text chat question that I think got inserted in there. So if we want to start with that, especially good following the mindfulness practice we just did.
Yeah, we can ask, just as Vicki gets started on the presentation, we want to hear from you. What role does mindfulness play in your professional or personal life? Just as we're thinking about bringing these concepts into our lives, we would love to reflect on it, each one of us as well.
Great. Okay, so as you all are thinking about that, we're just going to remind you of a couple of things that we talked about in the last webinar, which is really our approach to thinking about resilience and promoting thriving and well-being rather than just the absence of risk, and particularly in the aftermath of adversity. And we really started talking about the alternative to more risk-focused prevention strategies, admonishment kinds of strategies, just strengths-based approaches, and really talked about, use the idea of Swiss Army knives or a toolkit, that strengths are really about the density and diversity, the variety of strengths that people bring to the situation, not any one particular strength. And the advantage of these strengths-based approaches, as we argued in the first webinar, is that they really help us move beyond this idea of cold cognition prevention that's very much Sherry was telling us as we walked through that meditation about how, some of us walk through the world as though this part of ourselves is the most important, and we design our prevention in that way as well, that our prevention is about awareness and knowledge and thinking and rational choice. And in fact, the kinds of prevention behaviors we're trying to engage with are things that happen in hot moments when there's a lot of emotion going on. And so those strategies that we're teaching in the classroom don't always necessarily convey into those other hot cognition moments. And so strengths-based approaches can really help people develop their toolkit for dealing with those more hot sorts of moments. It also, strengths-based approaches create more inclusive prevention. We know based on studies of ACEs and polyvictimization, and that even if we're working with groups of young people in middle school or high school, we're not really in a completely primary prevention situation, because many of the participants in the room already have experiences with trauma that they are bringing with them to the prevention setting. And so strengths-based approaches really go across primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of prevention, and so make a more inclusive prevention program. We're helping people develop assets and resources, and what it helps people vision and develop strengths for what are we moving towards, not just what are we trying to move away from. And what we did present last time was our resilience portfolio model, which really tries to group. It doesn't see resilience as a personality trait. It sees it as a set of assets and resources that can be cultivated and strengthened through our prevention activities. And that when you look across the literature, there are really sort of three categories or buckets of strengths that we like to pay attention to. One is the regulatory strengths, related to emotion, awareness, emotion regulation, interpersonal strengths around relationships and support, ties to community, and then meaning making, the kinds of things that really get us outside of our individual selves and connected to broader purpose, service, and those kinds of things. And today we're going to be talking about some practices that have evidence-based that work across this portfolio, looking at regulatory, interpersonal, and meaning-making strengths. And we're going to start first with the relational level or bystander approaches. And I like to think about those as really strengthening both interpersonal and meaning-making strengths. I think maybe the interpersonal is more obvious, but I think that though it's relatively unexplored in the research, I do think that some of the appeal of bystander intervention and some of the promise of it, some of what we see in the literature, for example, on bystander approaches to bullying and looking at how it's related to moral development and awareness in children, really shows that there is a potential of bystander intervention to be a piece of that, getting outside yourself, contributing to social change, which can also contribute to meaning making, which is one of those areas of the portfolio that is relatively understudied compared to regulatory or interpersonal strengths. So I want to just start by, I choose to use the word actionist. There are lots of words out there: bystander, pro-social bystander, upstander, defender, supporter, gatekeeper. Different areas of public health prevention tend to adopt and use different terms. So gatekeeper is often used in the suicide prevention literature, defender often used related to bullying. Pro-social bystander we see a lot in the sexual violence field. I like actionist because it does kind of center the doing something to help, as opposed to bystander, which is a little bit, people's first response to bystander tends to be, people who stand by, which was the original use of the term, was actually people who didn't do anything. So just to kind of acclimate it, so lots of different terms you can use, we're all kind of talking about the same thing. We also, I think most of you probably on this are well familiar, because bystander intervention has become a real part of prevention portfolios for many organizations, about the different roles that actionists can play. They can create distraction, they can delegate or enlist others to be helpful. They can adopt some kind of direct intervention, directly confronting perpetrators, or they can be supporters of survivors, and they can help connect to resources. So lots of different roles when we're talking about actionist behaviors. And I want to just say that I think that we have some limitations in the current ways that we think about bystander intervention. It's derived from the early work of Latney and Darley and their situational model, which they were social psychologists. They were social psychologists, but they were also social psychologists, meaning that they focused a lot on individual behavior. So they talked a bit about situational context, specifically the presence of other bystanders or other third parties. But fundamentally, their model is really about individual choices and primarily about responding to risk. So they really talk about there being an emergency situation that people notice, define as an emergency, assume responsibility, and then might choose to step in and take action. And so it primarily focuses on reacting to a situation that is risky. I think that one of the innovations that's happened more recently in actionist training from a prevention standpoint is to focus on strengths, not just to focus on reducing risk. And that is related to thinking about social norms that may help prevent interpersonal violence. And there are a number of projects that have really starting to show not just that at first, we tend to study social norms related to problems like interpersonal violence by studying whether people perceive that their peers think it's okay, for example, to have sex with someone without getting an affirmative consent, or someone who is too intoxicated to give consent, or those kinds of things. That's a very risk-focused set of social norms, right? More recently, we've really started to measure and started to look at what we think about as more strengths-based norms, which is to what extent do you see your community or your peers or other students on your campus think it's a good idea to step in to, or to what extent is it appropriate to talk about healthy relationships, or to make a plan to keep one another safe and to stay together when you go out on a weekend. And we're seeing that those kinds of more prevention positive kinds of social norms are related both to increased bystander behavior, but also related to lower levels of perpetration. We also know that greater sense of community is also related to greater bystander intervention, and that bystander intervention can promote mattering and a sense of connection. These are some examples from a study that I did about asking both youth and adults in a community about their proactive helping. So things like, to what extent did they discuss prevention, use social media to talk about healthy relationships, talk about relationship safety. And again, you see that some of these things, like having conversations about relationship safety, really positive. Over 40% of high school students said that they were doing that. But a lot of these other things, relatively fewer people are talking about this more strengths-based notion of actionism. So we still have some room to grow some of that. Programs like Bringing in the Bystander, programs like Green Dot do show increases in bystander behavior over time. From an attitude perspective, increases in sense of responsibility and skills, and importantly, expanding the toolkit of what people have. Some of the research that I've done with colleagues shows that a key factor in intervening is also having a number of things that you can draw upon. So in that way, I think bystander prevention or building actionism fits very well within a resilience portfolio model, because it really is about enhancing a toolkit or a Swiss Army knife of strengths, not just one particular thing. And I think that we also can start to really think about building this more proactive piece of intervention. Some research I'm doing now is looking at suicide prevention and suicide exposure, and talking to young people who really talk about a whole variety of ways that they are trying to use their role as an actionist to promote and build other people's resilience portfolios, like conveying to other people a sense that they matter, and encouraging them in practicing mindfulness, and some of those kinds of things. Some key components of actionist training or bystander intervention. Again, most of them are built on the situational cognitive model. So they try to build awareness and noticing, giving people a sense of responsibility. I think that increasingly we are seeing a focus on training leadership, whether this is in the military or in schools or on campuses, that it's not enough to just train students, that we really need to be thinking about who are some of the policy leaders, the visual campus leaders, to try to reduce situational and social barriers, including consequences for bystanders. We see this already a lot on campuses, where Good Samaritan policies and things have been put in place to try to encourage actionists so that they don't get penalized for being in a situation, say, where there's underage drinking and they're reporting something going on. I think we've learned that we need to take time for the diffusion of this innovation. One study using Green Dot in high schools estimates it took about 4 years to start to see those effects. So again, we have to be thinking about our timeline for when we think that we're going to see some of these things. And so trying to think about, we also are, a colleague of mine, Sarah McMahon, just came out just this past year in the last couple months with a study looking at what survivors say is helpful from bystanders, and finding that, as we do with the social reactions literature to survivors, that not all bystanders are equally helpful in the eyes of survivors. And so we really want to be asking those questions on our campuses. What do the survivors in our community say would be most helpful? And I want to argue that because we're trying to develop relational strengths here, it's not just about the individual, but really building communities of bystanders. The Community Action and Mattering Initiative was actually a grant-funded study to look at Green Dot community. And it was actually trying to implement Green Dot in geographic towns to look at how can we try to improve social norms that say that everybody has a role to play, and where people really start to have the expectation that people in town are having conversations with young people about what healthy relationships look like, and that bystanders are supporting other actionists when they have the opportunity to try to assist when something's going on. In the newspaper, there have been a couple of really recent things that have been really interesting. The Comet Project, this is through Cooperative Extension, both in Wyoming. I saw there's somebody from Wyoming from the coalition who's here. There's some really cool work that's going on in Wyoming, and also in Wisconsin with Cooperative Extension, that is building communities for rural communities, and particularly for ranchers, for farmers, building a coffee shop space, for example, for people to come in to talk about their work, but then to also talk about mental health and to be positive actionists related to mental health and wellness and well-being. In the middle is another mental health training, the Confess Project, which is working in primarily Black communities through barbershops, and again, to train around talking about mental health and wellness and building strength. So it's not just about individuals, but it's also about broader bystanders and sources of strengths. Here's the Coffee Break Project. I think that's the one that's in Wyoming. And then Sources of Strength, which is a program for related to mental health first aid that's for young people. So building communities of actionists. And then just to end, I think that one of the things that we really want to be thinking about with bystander intervention is, I think in the early days, we used a lot of scenarios and things that were trying to heat up the way that people were acting as actionists, but I think we're still kind of this cold, removed, oh, here are these these fictitious people who aren't people I know. And I think it's related to, Sherry often in some of the trainings that we do talks about PrEP and approaches with relationship education, and how that lane of prevention went from using these kinds of role play or these sorts of scenarios about Tony and Maria, right? Use the West Side Story kind of thing. But, but instead getting couples to come in and talk about when they've had an actual argument, and to do some prevention work around that. I think we have a lot more that we might do related to bystander intervention, because I think our models to date are still much more about over there. We tend to do trainings, unless we're training a sports team or a Greek house, we are not necessarily training young people in the social network groups that they are a part of. And so I think we could do better in bystander intervention to really think about training people to talk about the things that matter with the people that matter in terms of bystander intervention, and to really use a social networks approach to really think about who are their friend groups, who are the people that they're spending time with, who matters to them, and cultivating those trainings and conversations with those folks. So I think I will, I'm at time. I want to give Sherry some time to move over. This is a project. You'll have this webinar and you'll have the links. This is a project that we did out west in South Dakota about getting youth to take action and help design prevention, including the bystander trainings. And so we really had youth training to do the trainings with other young people, which was really very much trying to use that social networks approach so that they were talking about real things that were happening in their lives and how they might approach them differently and support one another to do things differently. And I think that can be a really helpful approach. And so I urge you to, as we transition to the next section, to think about responding to risk, to think about actionism, and think about a situation that you've been part of. Maybe it's related to interpersonal violence, maybe it's related to workplace harassment, suicide risk, an incident of racism or microaggressions in the classroom, but to think for yourself about that and think about how you might apply some of these lessons, what more you might need to do to expand what you could do in that situation. But again, to kind of think about something that matters to you before you start trying to apply that to other people that you may be working with. So with that, I'll turn it over. We'll have our first interview interlude.
Yes, thank you so much, Vicki. I'm reading what's happening in the chat. I completely agree with you, Brandy. This is also not the model of bystander intervention that I am used to, and I think I would like to start there. So as we know, bystander approaches have been around for quite some time in prevention, although they really vary in depth and content, which I appreciate you speaking to. For that reason, I think bystander approaches can feel a little dated to people who haven't heard about these models or this way of doing it. If someone is at an agency where they're using a little bit more of a dated model of bystander intervention, how would you suggest that they start updating it and maybe moving a little bit more toward that actionist perspective that you shared about?
So maybe I'll just take that, Cherry, and then if you have some stuff that you want to add. Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. So thank you for asking that. I think that, one of the things that, the need is great in prevention. And so I think that we can latch on to new ideas, which seem really promising, and they move the needle a bit, but they don't solve the problem for us. And I think that what we do want to do is, if we see that it's not moving the needle at all, or it's making the needle worse, some things we talked about in the first webinar, then we want to move on from those, right? But when we have an approach like bystander intervention or actionism that starts to move the needle in the right direction, but it's not as far as we want to go, I would say let's not just throw it out. Let's do a deeper dive into how might we improve it. And I think that's some of the things that I was talking about just now, about how it's remained a very individual and very cold cognition type approach. Whereas where fundamentally bystander intervention or actionism is an interpersonal event, right? Often multiple people who are involved, which is really complicated. And so we need to be thinking about it as a relational event. And so we need to be thinking about how we bring people into trainings and into conversation about it to deal with the relational aspects, not just the in the head individual kind of piece.
Yeah, I think that is, I would totally agree with all of that. I suppose even a little bit more concretely, I think that there's always keeping up with Vicki's work, because I think she is one of the best people in that space, who is always trying to push ahead and doesn't necessarily get too attached to something, even because it seemed kind of cool in 1998 doesn't mean it has to be the same thing. I also think that, who she mentioned several times, Dorothy Edwards in the Green Dot, that they've done a lot, which Vicki knows a zillion times more about this than I do, but that they've done a lot to try to move their work into making more use of narrative and more use of thinking about community spaces, which Vicki talked a little bit about that before. So I would definitely suggest just keeping up with what's going on with Vicki and Dorothy Edwards and Green Dot as a way to do that. And then I also want to just say briefly, I would especially endorse what she said. And I think the way I think about bystanders is that that's an important skill and an important set of social norms to promote or actionist. But that if you put it into our portfolio model, that it's also important to understand that that's only one skill or one set of skills or one set of norms or attitudes that's going to be needed to really move the needle on preventing violence. And so the other thing I guess I would say is not to get too stuck on any one single tool as being the tool that's going to make all the difference. And sometimes you really have to push back on when you get approached or when you come across these curricula that are for sale, because that is where I think a lot of the embeddedness happens, is that somebody will do a program and they did this program in 2006 and they got really promising results. And so they turned it into this curriculum, and now one of these for-profit publishers sells it, and it can really stagnate in that space. And I think just to be aware that there's a lot happening in this field, and just think twice before you use something that was developed 15 or 20 years ago, because that's probably not going to be the most effective choice out there for you.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for sharing that. I needed to hear that. And I just really appreciate it, because I've always kind of felt that, but I didn't have the words to express it. And so I just really appreciate that expertise. Speaking of bringing bystander approaches into our present moment a little bit, I really loved what you shared about swapping out hypothetical couples for real life people and relationships. I was immediately thinking back to when I was in classrooms and seeing kids' eyes gloss over when we did the hypothetical situations. And I'm wondering if you have any examples or ideas of how that could be implemented in a younger setting. I know a lot of us where these programs end up getting implemented are in the classrooms. So how might someone bring those ideas there with a little bit of a younger dynamic?
So I think there are a number of different ways, and they're usually, I mean, concretely, they're usually things that are in your toolkits as preventionists already, which is to kind of listen to and gather some information before you go in there. So to do the pre-work of, whether it's a focus group or whether it's, having people, give some examples. I mean, Sherry and I have had the experience of just the exercise I just described to you, which is to give people some time to think of an actual situation and then to talk about it with one another. So that's one slightly less individual, but still individual, because I'm bringing my own story and I don't necessarily know you into the conversation. I think that there are other spaces where, and again, I don't think it's been studied this way, but this is another tangent that we won't get on today, but about deconstructing what are the pieces of our programs that are creating the needle movement that we want to see. But I'm very compelled and interested, for example, in the Coaching Boys into Men program that Elizabeth Miller has evaluated and that has shown some promise. What I think is really interesting about that program is that young people are trained on teams by coaches. But I think, to me, what's interesting is that they're on a team together. They already know each other. My bet, I don't know, again, because I haven't sat through their program, is that in that space, some of those shared hot moments come up. So that if you allow for it and build it in and say, who has an example, you don't have to name names, they may bring up things that people are aware of. And then they can talk about them together in a social network that's already spending time together, so they can deconstruct that. I think the other piece is that too often our training programs are one and done. I know on college campuses, when I was first starting in bystander intervention, that's often, or maybe it was spread out over 2 or 3 sessions. but then it was done. And I think that if instead you have checkups, if you have a more ongoing model where people come back, you can then ask them, so how did it go? We did that actually with one of our first evaluations. It was part of the evaluation, not the program, but we brought people back in a focus group and said, so you did that program a few months ago. How did it go for you? And they loved that focus group because they actually brought real situations in there and said, well, this actually didn't go so well. Could we talk about it? So those kinds of things.
I think your question is so important because it also gets at some of the developmental trajectories, which we have tried to talk about in the book, and especially that's been an area of interest for Vicki. But I think that a lot of times, if we think that we're preventing teen dating violence and sexual assault, that we have to start with people who are at the age where they're pairing up in romantic relationships. But I think it's important for us to understand that this is just, obviously those relationships are unique in a lot of ways, from friendships or from family relationships or from relationships with teachers or other adults. But there's also ways in which they have a lot of overlap. And so I think that another thing we could start getting more creative about is thinking about teaching bystander focused programs that target bullying, for example. And so you could pair people up, or you could talk about real things that had happened in the classroom or in the school, or you could give them tasks that they would have to navigate together and help them work through some of those types of issues, so that they are getting real life practice about things that are happening with the relationships that they have in that moment, instead of just being introduced to these hypothetical scenarios.
Thank you. That's really powerful. And I want to do a quick time check. Do we have time for one more interview question, or do you think it's best? I have one more to ask, but also if we want to transition, that's totally fine.
Go ahead. I think we can do one more question.
Great, thank you. Well, kind of leading us into the transition of the next section of our web conference, I'm really curious about you two and what made you want to focus in on mindfulness and bystander approaches in your research and portfolio model.
I'm gonna let Sherry go first on this one.
Okay, well, for me, it was, for mindfulness, it was kind of a combination of, this might sound a little strange to say, I suppose, but part of it was just following the science. So I did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago with a student where we were looking at interventions that most promote meaning in life, and which I'll mention again in a minute, and mindfulness won over lots of other different options, and doing the review for this book. And so just realizing that it kept coming up over and over again is working really well in these different places. I kept coming across it, and so starting to invest more on it that way. And also a colleague of ours, Bonnie Duran, is a really well-known mindfulness practitioner and teacher at Spirit Rock, and she had been personally encouraging me to, and she finally did talk me into going out and doing a week-long silent meditation retreat at Spirit Rock, which is probably 6 or 7 years ago now. And that was a really powerful experience for me. So I think it was a combination of that personal experience and that relationship with Bonnie, and then just feeling like it was popping up all over the place in the scientific literature.
And I'll add to that on the mindfulness that for me, it was also about following the scientist. So working with Sherry and following her lead on that really brought me into thinking about mindfulness in some different ways. So I very much appreciate that. And from a bystander perspective, it's also about following the practitioners. So I got into studying bystander intervention because of relationships with practitioners. So I was working and talking with the head of the campus advocacy center and with the head of the statewide coalition, and they were talking about, they and the coalition members were talking about the bystander intervention and were excited about it, but at that point there hadn't been any evaluation of it. And so I, just because of the relationship I had with them, we put together wrote a grant together to do some evaluation of bystander intervention, and then we were off to the races. So yeah.
I love that. Thank you. Thanks for bringing a little bit of your personal experience and passion into this. The passion really shows through in your work. Well, with that, I would love to pass it on to you, Sherry, to continue on mindfulness.
All right, great. Thank you.
After I ask this quick
Oh.
chat question to everyone, apologies. So as we're transitioning into mindfulness, we kind of shared about earlier, we asked how you are integrating it into your personal and professional spaces. Now we'd like to ask, what are some opportunities for you to integrate it into your work or organization? Just something to reflect on as Sherry is sharing.
All right, great. Thank you. Okay, so getting back to mindfulness, as I was just mentioning, I really believe that mindfulness is rising to the top in the scientific literature. And of course, this is a very old practice. It's 2,500 some odd years old, that was originally developed as part of Buddhism, but it's also been a part of mainstream therapeutic approaches since the probably 1970s and 1980s, with mindfulness-based stress reduction and some of the other approaches that have been developed based on ancient mindfulness practices. And at first, it was really dismissed. I don't know if how many of you on here are old enough to recall back into the 1970s and 80s like I can, but it really was considered kind of flaky. People didn't really take it seriously. But that has slowly changed, and it has now been incorporated in a lot of randomized controlled trials, and it has shown really amazing results, which, if you think about it, of course, is probably not that surprising, because anything that has lasted more than 2,500 years probably had to be a really powerful practice to last into the present day, because of course we don't know that much else about what was going on during that time, but we know a lot about how mindfulness emerged so many eons ago. And so for regarding prevention, Tao and his colleagues did a meta-analysis on reducing aggression. This was mostly done in classroom settings with elementary and high school age students. And he got an effect size of a G of 0.48. And what that means in more easily understandable terms is that means that they moved the participants about half a standard deviation compared to the control group in terms of reducing aggression. That is a pretty big, if you think about making baby steps or giant steps in your progress, that is really getting into a pretty good sized step. It is most of the meta-analyses that have been done on more traditional psychoeducational types of things with red flags and warning signs about toxic relationships or sexual assault, those don't have very big effect sizes. A lot of them are in the 0.10 range or even smaller than that, and hardly any of them are over 0.2, not just for violence prevention, but also for things like substance abuse prevention or delinquency prevention or suicide prevention. Those are all pretty much in the baby step category for the most part. And so we're looking at a prevention effect that's 5 times bigger, if not even bigger than that, than most of the other alternatives that are out there. As I mentioned, my student and I did a meta-analysis on meaning making, because part of our work in the prevention portfolio has shown that meaning making is one of the most important elements for important psychosocial strength you can have for helping people overcome trauma. And once again, mindfulness won. We didn't really go in with any expectations. We weren't specifically trying to look at mindfulness, but we compared it to psychotherapy and psychoeducation and several other interventions, and that's the one that came out the best. And then there have been other similar meta-analyses on that. The one I think might be also worth mentioning is the last one on this list on this slide, where this team looked at more than 400 randomized controlled trials of all different kinds of psychotherapeutic interventions to promote well-being in both community and in clinical samples. And mindfulness came out number one for that too, in both the clinical and the community populations. And one of the most interesting things about that meta-analysis is that you could almost see the order of the effect size based on how much mindfulness was a component in the other psychotherapies that they studied. So another intervention that did really well was acceptance and commitment therapy, Steve Hayes therapy, which probably some of you are familiar with, which, as you may know, has a really huge mindfulness component in it. Dialectical behavior therapy did better than straight CBT, which also has a mindfulness component in it. And so you could really see this sort of dose response effect with how well interventions were doing based on how much mindfulness was included in the programming. And that I have found to be really compelling sets of evidence. A lot of the work in prevention is inhibited or limited because a lot of the studies, there are only one or two studies on a particular program, and often it's by the person who developed that program. And what you can have here with mindfulness is that there have been a lot of different types of studies by a lot of different research teams, even looking at slightly different questions, as you can see on this slide here. And all of them are finding that mindfulness is a really powerful intervention tool. And I think when you have that range of different evidence coming from different sources like that, that is also makes it all the more compelling. So I do think that there are a few common misconceptions out here about mindfulness, and I could see from the chat earlier that some of you are already quite familiar with it. So this might be familiar to some of you, but just to make sure that everyone's on the same page about this, is that it's not the same as relaxation or trying to make yourself pay better attention. And it's definitely not about really forcing yourself to do anything. It's really more to this invitation to become more self-aware and to stay more focused in the present moment. And so the idea is, and I personally find it, like a lot of people, I have an inner critic that gives me a fair amount of grief sometimes. And I have found mindfulness really helpful for learning to accept my thoughts and feelings without judgment, with being able to silence that person in my head that is like, you're not working fast enough, or this isn't good enough. And so instead of what a lot of times my instinctive response to that is one that's very anti-mindful, which is just to try to push that away or hush that inner critic up or get in an argument with that inner critic. And mindfulness is really different from that, because it is just it's just, you're not supposed to try to either push something away or grasp it. Either one is not a mindful approach, and so it helps you just accept those thoughts, to be willing to spend a little time thinking about them, but not get attached to them. And I have found that a very useful way of thinking about it. Sometimes people use metaphors like leaves floating down a stream. And so then you can become more of an observer of your thoughts, like, oh, there that inner critic goes again. And so instead of getting all caught up in it, you just sort of acknowledge it and then move on. And I have found that to be very powerful personally, as well as helpful for a lot of people that I work with in a variety of settings. And then I guess the last thing I want to mention here about this on this slide is that an important element of mindful practice is Sangha, which is part of being a mindful, loving kindness community. It is a lot harder to do mindfulness practice on your own. And my first, 4 or 5 introductions to it were basically about trying to take it up as an individual practice. And of course, it's not impossible to do that. I have personal friends and acquaintances who do that, but certainly in traditional Buddhist practice and in most contemporary practices, having that community of fellow practitioners is really important. And my most regular practice of my own mindfulness comes from an online writing group that we do with my center, where we meet twice a week, and it is really, it's so powerful. I hope you might even have had a taste of that even in the short thing we did today, to think about how important it is to, or how powerful it is to meditate with a group. So there are a bunch of different types of mindfulness meditations. We did a body scan at the top of the session. You can do a loving kindness one, which just invites people to send loving kindness messages to themselves and to their family and their community. And then usually it gets bigger and bigger until you're sending a message out to all sentient beings everywhere. I did not know, I had never heard of walking meditation until I went and did that week-long silent meditation retreat at Spirit Rock that I mentioned several years ago. And those can be really powerful too, because they help us get in touch with our whole body. And sometimes I think we tend to experience ourselves mostly from the outside, so that if I reach over and with one hand and touch the other hand, a lot of my experience of that in my usual everyday way of being in the world is to think about the feeling of like this hand getting touched, but this hand is doing the touching. And so that should just be as strong a feeling of awareness and connection for you. And so walking meditation is one of several tools in mindfulness to help you get more in touch and experience directly that feeling of that you are your whole body, and that you're not just something that's being done to from the outside like that. And a labyrinth meditation is one type of walking meditation. And if you might find, I didn't realize until fairly recently that there are 4 labyrinths within just a few miles of my house. And so there are spaces like that, and those can be really powerful places to have good mindfulness experiences too, that you might think about taking a classroom to, if you work with students or a group or a client or anything like that. One of the best things I love about mindfulness is one that Janae mentioned earlier, is that it's really easy and accessible. You don't have to be a licensed provider to do mindfulness. You don't need any special equipment or tools. You can literally do it, anywhere that you are awake. And the other thing I really love about it is that you don't have to be very good at it for it to work. And I think one of the problems with a lot of the violence prevention and a lot of the psychotherapy that we offer is that it's pretty tricky to get that exact right balance of doing it in a way that is going to have the maximum positive impact. And it is easy to do in a way that is not very helpful. And it certainly is true that you can screw up mindfulness. I have heard a couple of stories about people sort of trying to use that forced relaxation approach, which is a gross misunderstanding of what mindfulness is. But for the most part, you don't have to reach some kind of enlightenment or some sort of nirvana or become some kind of bodhisattva or anything like that. I mean, I don't think I'm actually a particularly good mindful practitioner. My mind wanders. I can be kind of fidgety sometimes. But the great thing about it is that even though I don't implement it in some, perfect way, that I still get a lot of benefit from it. And so I think that is one of the most valuable things about it. As for an introduction, I really love Mindfulness Daily, which is a 40-day free online course by 2 of the most prominent mindful practitioners in the United States, Tara Brach and Jack Kornfield. Maybe it's Kornfeld, which you can find if you just Google Mindfulness Daily, it'll come right to it. And I think it's a wonderful introduction for people that anybody who has internet access can get to. And there's also, I'm not going to go over all these links, but just some other ones that you can check out when you look at the slides. And So in terms of thinking about incorporating mindfulness, I think it is really easy to incorporate into a lot of different spaces. And one of the wonderful things about it is that you can slip it in, as we did at the beginning of this session. It only takes 5 minutes to add it in. And so even if you're under pressure to say that you're doing, I don't know, cognitive behavioral therapy, or you're doing some kind of formal violence prevention programming, or whatever it is you have to sort of tick your box off and say you're doing, you can add a piece of mindfulness to that, probably make a big boost in your impact, and not have any problems of being like, well, I thought you were going to be doing violence prevention or something like that. So I think in terms of professional workspaces, it's easy to do at the beginning of a daily shift or at a staff meeting. I think it would be wonderful if you could start working on your organizations to let mindfulness retreats qualify for professional development resources. And if you're interested, there's the link to our online writing group that LifePaths does, which you're welcome to join. I think, no, like, how we're doing. I guess we're doing okay. And then I think in terms of integrating it into therapeutic spaces, I think you can do the same thing. You can do it at the beginning of a therapy session, or if you're doing it in a prevention program. If you're doing a canned prevention curriculum that's 3 sessions or 6 sessions, you could just take 5 minutes at the beginning of each one of those. It's so easy to integrate into things, and there's tons of scripts online that you can download for easy 5-minute meditative practices. I think we might have time just to do one more quick experiential one. So for this one, thought we would just try to focus on the breath. A lot of mindfulness meditation focuses on the breath. So I just invite you to close your eyes again, or just look downward with a soft gaze. Again, try to adjust yourself so that you're balanced between left and right. Check your posture. Roll your shoulders back again. Let's just spend a moment thinking about our friend, the breath. Our breath is always with us. Many common mindful exercises will use a counting routine. Like one common one is just to inhale for a count of 4 and hold at the top for 2. And then exhale for 6. As you think about your breath, try to breathe in through your nostrils. You might notice the coolness of the air as it goes in your nostrils. Hold at the top briefly and exhale through the mouth. You might notice temperature difference where you can feel the warmth that your body has infused that air with. And as it comes out your mouth, that it's much warmer than it was when you inhaled it through your nose. And the idea in mindfulness is to really just bring yourself to the present moment. And the breath is a wonderful tool for doing that, because it's something you're always doing in the present moment. Just focus on your breath. Try to forget all the to-do list. Maybe you're already thinking about the next meeting you have to go to, or something you need to finish by the end of the day. It's all right if those thoughts come to your mind. It's also just let them go, let them pass. Don't get attached to them. just return your attention to the breath. Jack Kornfield has a metaphor that I really like, that he thinks about your attention like a puppy, because a lot of times when I am doing mindfulness meditation, so many other things come to mind, all the things I have to do, what I'm going to make for dinner. I mean, just so, what somebody said to me that I either liked or didn't like. I mean, just, and often when I think about trying to stay focused on the breath and I feel like I'm not doing a good job about that, I can be very harsh with myself. But he says to just think about your attention like a puppy. Now, I personally really love puppies, so if you're not a puppy person, then you should think of something different. But we'll try puppies for the moment. And, the thing about puppies, if you've ever been around one, is that they're very wiggly and squirmy and they're full of energy. And so if your attention, like a puppy, just starts to squirm and wiggle and go off to your to-do list or your shopping or your errands, then you can just go and pick it up in the loving way that you would pick up a puppy and just bring it back to this moment, bring it back to this breath, smile at the puppy, and come back to the breath. And I found that a very helpful metaphor, because I don't really get mad at puppies no matter how wiggly or squirmy they are. Just like you should not get mad at yourself. As you attempt this practice, we're always practicing. Just take this moment to feel your breath. We'll end with just one last big inhale and exhale. And I will turn it back over to Janae.
Thank you. This time I opted to turn off my camera the first time I was looking at myself stretching my mouth, and I was like, great, and not again. Thank you so much for leading us through that, Sherry. So I was thinking back to the very beginning of what you were sharing. You talked about the history and the context of mindfulness, its origins as a Buddhist practice, how it was dismissed by colonial practices and is only now being taken seriously. I couldn't help but think to the deep parallels to how white supremacy permeates this movement and some of the approaches that we take to prevent violence. We keep hearing this message from leaders of color in the field that we have to do something different and start listening to their expertise. And I heard that message yet again when you were sharing that example. How have you seen that theme come up in your work and spaces? And how can people make space for more non-quote traditional approaches in this movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I totally agree with you. And I think you can see that not only about mindfulness, but also I've done a fair number of projects in Native communities. And I think you see it there too, where a lot of traditional ceremonies have been dismissed, or even for many years were, in my lifetime, many of them were outlawed to follow their own religious practices. And it wasn't until the 1970s that some of those laws were overturned. And I think that it's always difficult to know when we're practicing our own culture sometimes, but I also think it is really important to become aware of that and to be aware of when we're practicing white culture, and to be very, to kind of approach a problem with facts and figures and with, that is just a certain way of being in the world, and it can be very academic way of being in the world. And sometimes I think we have to realize when we are taking approaches that make sense for us. So, or even, Vicky I've heard talk about this too, that that school was not a pleasant experience for everybody. And so to assume that some kind of school-like experience where you're learning material and taking little quizzes and doing little exercise is going to be a helpful approach for everybody is to make big assumptions that are often based about our own backgrounds. And I think we always do need to go unpack those assumptions. And of course, the best way to do that is to go and talk to the people that we're supposed to be working with and treat them as colleagues and flatten that hierarchy. And I mean, even if you're talking, even if you work with 5-year-olds, it doesn't matter who you're working with, and to find out what kinds of things matter for them. And to, I appreciate I appreciate this about Prevent Connect, that you have this interview approach. And so I'm sure all of us have been to tons of webinars where it's just like slide after slide after slide full of data and data and data. And that's not necessarily the way that really even people who have spent a lot of time in school and really identify as academics like I do necessarily learn things. And so I think it is important to make space for people's stories and people's experience and to form relationships and to not get too focused on facts and figures, and to realize that whether this is a particular institutional culture or a particular community-based culture, that a lot of times we're bringing our own cultural histories and expectations with us when we don't know it.
And I would echo that, Sherry. I know, Janae, this wasn't specific to your question, but just to extend it back to thinking about bystander intervention or actionist training. One of the biggest assumptions that we made about that at the very beginning of the field, at least from a research perspective, but in partnership with practitioners, right, was that bystander intervention was all good, that war was better, right? And that's not necessarily the case. And it's also not necessarily the case that everyone who takes action will be received in their actionism in the same way. And so I think, Janae, to one of your earlier questions, which to me links to this, how do we keep bystander intervention innovative? How do we keep improving upon it? It's again, those strategies that you were just talking about, Sherry. So I had the good fortune to be part of a project with Sarah McMahon, where we did concept mapping interviews with a variety of students from communities on our campus who are not usually, their voices are not usually centered in our prevention approaches. And so we had students of color and we had LGBTQ plus students who were part of these structured focus groups, and they really were reflecting about bystander intervention and all the ways in which the current training was very, very limited and did not include the kinds of social change and systemic evaluation that was really needed. So I think that these recommendations are really important across our prevention work.
Thank you. I really appreciate you bringing their voices in. I am really loving the mindfulness approach, especially thinking about working with youth and my work with youth. I can already see opportunities to bring it into youth spaces, to de-escalate situations in a strengths-based way and teach valuable skills. I'm also thinking about a challenge that often comes up in this field, which is consistency, where we implement something in the spaces that we are in, and then we have no control over what happens when people leave those spaces, wanting to make sure, is it being reinforced by their social circles, by their parents, by their teachers, or their guardians? I'm also thinking back in the chat where people were sharing that not everyone buys into a mindfulness approach, or it can take a little bit longer. How would you recommend that practitioners communicate about mindfulness so that people see its effectiveness and are more likely to get on board and reinforce the work that we do?
Well, I think that part of that is just persistence and just looking for opportunities or making opportunities, but and trying to implement it and letting people, I don't know, maybe somebody would be persuaded like I am by all of the evidence about it. I think the biggest pushback that I've gotten from it myself has been this sense that prevention means information sharing, and prevention means, quizzes and exercises and things like that, and not experiential things. But I guess if you're trying to look at a different approach to prevention in your schools, that you could just start with some of the stuff that we've already talked about, like that focus group that Vicki mentioned when they came back, and they're like, well, we tried to do this and it turned out this way. And so if you could take a similar approach with your staff, like, how are you feeling about this prevention experience? Like you, I have also, because I've been in settings in years past where they were like, here, this is the curriculum we're doing, and these are the classes that you're assigned to. And and so you go out there and you try to do it, and then, like you said, you see their eyes glaze over when they start doing these scenarios or other types of content. And so I think a lot of people have that experience, and maybe if you just start with their experience, and are they satisfied with the prevention that's happening now, and invite them to think about if they would like to try something that might have a different way of approaching the problem. And I don't know, what would you say, Vicki?
Sorry, trying to get the unmute to work. So so I would say those things, and I would say two other pieces, and one just left to my mind. I hate it when that happens. So I'll talk about the other one. With professional spaces, that's what I was going to start with. So sometimes it's really just about centering your own courage. I saw in the chat people talking about trying to introduce it in a staff meeting, or, and how do you respond to people with their big agendas, and, the urgency of all, and, some of which is true and some of which is concocted by type A personalities. I know I am one, so I can, but also just about trying it in small bits in ways that are kind of low resource, low investment, and then seeing. So Sherry and I have the experience. Sherry is the founding creator of Resilience Conference, which we like to say is sort of the unconference. It's very different from other kinds of conferences in that it's a lot more like these sorts of interviews and lots of interaction, and in having mindfulness moments in between sessions and things like that. And I know that my first feeling when we started to do that conference and do things in that way was this tightness in my chest, and how is this going to be received? And people signed up for it. They were a self-selected bunch, but they still didn't really know what they were in for. And it was kind of like, how's this going to go? And it's become just so incredibly successful, where people just over time, they were willing to give it a go. Like, come on, just humor us. Just give it a go a couple times, right? And then people start to see the benefits and really come back asking for more. So, maybe don't start with a silent retreat with your staff, right? It's probably going to be hard to get people to buy into that. But, if you start with 5 minutes, just humor me. It's just 5 minutes, just to center ourselves before we get into the important agenda work that we're doing, right? Whatever it takes. And then you can find, my experience is starting with even 5 minutes. After you've done it a couple times, you actually see some benefit. So you may have that. And I think that's the same with when you're working with young people. I've had the good experience with several programs where young people are working with their parents or working with their teachers. When you start to put young people in the lead and they start doing this kind of strengths-based work, my experience is that they respond very well to it. And if you get them telling their parents and teachers that they need to be doing more of it, that they are much more effective than if we go in and say that they need to do that.
Yeah, I would just like to add, because I just finally got a chance to take a quick glance at what's in the chat, that, that all that said, I think you do have to exercise your own judgment, and your circumstances better than anyone. And, mindfulness alone is not going to take a toxic workspace and turn it into a safe workspace. And so if you're in a space that is already toxic, you might be able to do what Vicki said and get a group who are willing to try it or do it, and maybe like a staff meeting where there might be more pressure on everybody to do it would not be the right place to do it. Or, take other steps to try to address the toxicity before you try to introduce mindfulness. So I do think it is important that you are in a reasonably safe space before you try to bring in a program like that, because as a couple of you mentioned in the chat, it does involve not a huge amount of vulnerability. I mean, you're just kind of sitting quietly with your eyes closed, but if you can't trust the people in the room to, if you don't feel safe enough to close your eyes with them, then that's not the time to introduce mindfulness. And I do know it's always surprising to me how even in this space of people who work on domestic violence and sexual assault and other kinds of violence professionally, that there are still a number of people who have not worked out their own perpetration issues that are in this field too. So I certainly would be respectful of that.
Thank you both for your perspectives. I know that we have about 4 minutes left. I want to make sure that people get a chance to ask questions if they have any. So please, if you have a question for Sherry or Vicky, please throw it in the chat. And if not, I have one more question for you as we close it out, which is, what are some of your favorite ways to integrate mindfulness into the spaces that you occupy?
Well, I have started doing them at the top of pretty much every talk that I give, and it has really, I mean, the first couple times I felt pretty nervous about doing that because it's outside of, like, when you invite a researcher to come and give a talk to your group, you're not really expecting to close your eyes and start counting your breaths. But it's been really positively received. And then I've already mentioned the mindful writing group. When I didn't have my own Sangha, my own community here, that has just been really terrific. And I think that's quite flexible, that people could use in a lot of spaces. And there was some resistance there because we do spend some of the time on mindfulness and on check-ins and checkouts instead of just working. But I often find that is my most productive slots of the week, even though there is that time that is on these other things. And I think that's like the real secret, whether you use mindfulness or some other way of doing it, that just making sure you're getting enough rest and restoration to really bring your whole self to the work. And so that has really been powerful for me.
Yeah, I would agree. I also do the mindful writing group and really value that kind of piece, and am fortunate to be in a workspace where people are kind of thinking about this. But I think your earlier point was really important, Sherry, about having to have that foundation of safety, which not everyone has in their workspace. But yeah, so I guess not much more to say than that.
Thank you. Well, thank you both for this incredibly valuable and insightful training. And thank you for everyone who's joined us. You can keep up with Sherry and Vicky's work through their book. We do have a giveaway happening on social media for their book. If you'd like to receive a free copy, we will be posting again later today. And you can find their TED Talks as well. Vicky, Sherry, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything you want to leave our audience with as we close out the day?
Just want to say a big thank you for inviting us to share the space with you all today. It's been great, and we'll see hopefully all of you next week for the third one.
Yes, same for me. Thanks so much. And a special thanks to Ashley and Janae.
Thank you. And we will send a follow-up after this web conference closes with recordings, slides, and a survey. So please keep your eyes out for that. Have a great day, everyone.